Hello, my name is Kate Fox. I'm the Executive Director of the Salem Office of Tourism and Cultural Affairs, and we are here today with a panel of historians and authors who are experts on the topic of the Salem Witch Trials. Salem was founded in 1626 by members of the Dorchester Company who came looking for better farmland and fishing. And we are most known around the world as the Witch City because of what happened in 1692 during the Salem Witch Trials. Today we are going to talk about the witch trials and address some of the misconceptions that have resulted from increased media attention through television, movies, novels, and historical accounts, games, and video games that focus on the Salem Witch Trials. Today, let me introduce our panel. We have Richard Trask to my right, who has served as the archivist for the town of Danvers, Massachusetts, which is Old Salem Village, since 1972. His expertise in the Salem witchcraft era has allowed him to restore his own 17th century home, direct the excavation of the 1681 Reverend Samuel Paris Parsonage archaeological site where the witchcraft events began, serve as curator of the 1678 Rebecca Nurse Homestead, design a reproduction of the 1672 Salem Village Meeting House, author the book The Devil Hath Been Raised, Rescue the 1681 Zerubbabel, did I get that right? Zerubbabel Endicott house frame, serve as historical consultant to various films and documentaries, including Three Sovereigns for Sarah, and co-design the 1992 Salem Village Witchcraft Victims Memorial. Trask was also the chairman of the 1992 Salem Village Witchcraft Tercentennial Committee, which included 8 major programs, including the reburial of witchcraft victim George Jacobs and fabricating a major exhibit on the events of 1692. And have done tremendous amount of research and been a resource for all of us locally who have been working in the Salem Witch Trials. Next, we have Emerson Tad Baker, who is a professor of history at Salem State University. He is the award-winning author of numerous works on the history and archaeology of early New England, including The Devil of Great Island, Witchcraft and Conflict in Early New England. He was an on-camera expert for the PBS TV series Colonial House and has appeared in many witchcraft documentaries, including Salem Witch Hunt, Examine the Evidence. His new book, A Storm of Witchcraft, The Salem Witch Trials and the American Experience, will be available on October 1st.
Yay.
Welcome. Marilynne Roach is an independent researcher who has spent nearly 4 decades studying the Salem Witch Trials. Her books include The Salem Witch Trials, a day-by-day chronicle of a community under siege, and 6 Women of Salem, the accused and their accusers in the Salem Witch Trials. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And Katherine Howe is the New York Times best-selling author of The Physic Book of Deliverance Dane and The House of Velvet and Glass and Conversion. She has hosted Salem Unmasking the Devil for the National Geographic Channel, and her fiction has been translated into over 25 languages. A native Texan, she lives in New England and upstate New York, where she teaches at Cornell and is at work on her next novel. Thank you for being here. Thank you. So I want to give each of you the opportunity to talk about a new, upcoming, or past publication and the work that you've done so that the people watching are able to learn more, and we will start with Katherine.
Well, my first novel, The Physic Book of Deliverance Dane, was a New York Times bestseller and talks about what if one of the witches at Salem were the real thing, but not in the pointy hat, green warty nose kind of sense. What if she were the real thing, the way the colonists believed witches actually to be? My current project is a young adult novel called Conversion, which is also a Salem story, but this time we're looking at it from the standpoint of the afflicted girls. So it's kind of an updating of The Crucible set in a contemporary Massachusetts prep school. And on September 30th, I have a collection of primary sources relating to Salem and also witchcraft in North America more generally, coming from Penguin Classics, called The Penguin Book of Witches.
Nice. And we will look for that. Marilynne.
Well, in 2002, my book, The Salem Witch Trials, a day-by-day chronicle of a community under siege, came out, which attempted to tell everything I could possibly find, and it took 27 years of looking and trying to get it in there. I had the advantage that there were scholars working off to the side that I could then read their works and incorporate it. That tries to tell everything. In hardback, it's 2.5 pounds. It's still in print. And last year, my next witchcraft book came out, 6 Women of Salem, the accused and the accusers, the accused and their accusers in the Salem Witch Trials, which takes a biographical focus on 6 specific individuals and tells their stories.
It's on my bedside table.
Thank you.
Tad.
My last book was The Devil of Great Ireland, which is about witchcraft and conflict in early New England, and it focuses around a case of witchcraft 10 years before Salem, set in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in a debauched Quaker tavern that's supernaturally assaulted by flying stones all summer long. And sort of is one of the many, many cases of interesting witchcraft that took place in New England before 1692. But ironically, a number of the people involved in that case end up in Salem 10 years later, which led me to my current book, which will be out October 1st. It's called A Storm of Witchcraft, The Salem Trials and the American Experience. And it tries to take Salem witchcraft trials and put them in the broader context of Salem and America's history, from the founding of Salem to, in 1626, to which city today, looking at their trials and their lasting significance as a pivotal moment in American history.
Look forward to it. And Richard.
I have to say, I really enjoyed seeing Marilynne on The Daily Show.
Yes, that was wonderful.
With Jon Stewart, who was so nice.
Yeah, he did ask if I was a witch, though.
Yes, he did. But he had a grin when he said it.
Yes, he did.
Did you tell him the truth?
I said no, I denied it.
But that's the pinnacle of writing, I think, to get on that.
Absolutely.
My stuff is all ancient history. Back in the 70s, I did a Jackdaw, which was an educational packet, which I think the National Park still sells, but don't worry, I don't get anything out of it. And a while back, I did a introduction to, I think, one of the most interesting of the books that came out of the witchcraft time, which was John Hale's Modest Inquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft. And then in 1992, I thought, I've never written anything really on witchcraft. I should do something, but I still cheated. I used documents. And I did a book that's still in print, because I print them, which is called...
And available for sale at the National Park Service.
Which is called The Devil Hath Been Raised. And all it is a consideration of March 1692, the pivotal month of the witchcraft. And I try to show every bit and piece that came, and I did it in chronological order. The thing I'm most proud of, and there are very few of these copies around, is I co-edited with a very interesting group of international editors a book called The Salem Witch Hunt, which was done by Cambridge University Press, and it's a doing of all of the witchcraft documents with some good essays. It's a tome.
It's a fantastic achievement.
Amazing.
Oh, it's a doorstop.
And it's a hard book to get through, but it's one that any serious person should take a look at. I'll tell you, I will never write a book on Salem witchcraft. To me, it is too daunting a subject, and I could never do it.
But Kate, let me say, for the Salem witch hunt that Richard and Marilynne were both involved in, and Marilynne's day-to-day account, I could never have written my book on the Salem Witch Trials without those 2 books. They have made that job almost manageable because they're such amazing, detailed, and one was the day-to-day guide, and then also having the documents. It really, if you're really interested in the trials, those are the two books to start with.
Well,
and Bernie Rosenthal was the editor-in-chief, and he should get sainthood for it.
It was only took about how many years, Richard? It was about 10 years in the making, at least?
He had said, can you commit to 2 years? And after 11 years, we thought maybe we were going a little too far.
It is definitely a topic with great depth, and we're so fortunate to have the 4 of you as resources to interpret and tell the stories and continue to make them relevant from 1692. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are going to ask some questions and have a conversation about the Salem Witch Trials, and I am going to start with the question that we are asked most in Salem, especially as we come into our October and Haunted Happenings season. What is the difference between Salem and Danvers, and where did the witch trials happen?
I'm going to answer that. When Salem was settled, about 6 years later, a number of farmers from Salem decided to go west into the interior and set up farming. And that area began known as Salem Farms and Salem Village. Salem Village prospered, and by the 1650s, 1660s, there were enough people who lived there that they wanted to be independent, both as an ecclesiastical organization as well as independently as a township. But Salem Town didn't want them to do so. They liked it that the village was a breadbasket for them. And the whole history of what became Danvers is a period of time in which they're trying to break off from Salem, and Salem doesn't allow them. They finally broke off in the 1750s, but until then it was part of Salem Town. Now in 1692, when the witchcraft events began, they actually began in Salem Village, in the minister's parsonage in the village itself. By that time, Salem Village did have a meeting house. It was not an independent church. If people wanted to partake of sacraments, they would have to go to Salem, but they were able to hear the Word of God and worship together on Sundays and Wednesdays. But when the witchcraft began, it was actually in the minister's parsonage in the village. And for the ensuing 8 months of terrible conflict, what you have is the village being extremely caught up in it, so that every family was either having an accused person or an accuser there, in some cases both. And the population of Salem Village was about 500. So it was a real bad thing that happened to the community. Salem Town, the shire community of Essex County, did have their witchcraft victims, but a much larger population. And they didn't go through the emotional rigors that the village did. When the trials took place, they did take place in the shire community in Salem. But Salem Town never was affected the way the village was. And it took the village generations to get over this. When I was a kid back in the 1950s living in Danvers, you just didn't talk about witchcraft in polite society. When we began the excavation of the Reverend Parris house in 1970, I can remember we had a school group come to look at the excavation and hear about it. And we had 2 elderly women across the street whose family went all the way back to 1692. And I can remember as the kids were getting off the bus, these 2 elderly women came out and they shook their fist at me and said, "Why are you talking about this?" So we had a lot of guilt complex, and it actually did last for a long period of time. Salem Town, on the other hand, had many other things that they were doing. When you get to the 1870s thereabouts with the American Centennial, you start finding that everybody loves things to do with colonial. And that includes the time of the early settlement and of witchcraft. And in Salem Town, Dana Lowe's, which was a jewelry store, started selling spoons and little placards that women could wear with witches riding on broomsticks, and it kind of metamorphosized the horror of 1692 into a cutesy witch with a conical hat, the crook nose, riding on a broomstick.
Right, and that is believed to be the first souvenir spoon, that Daniel Lowe spoon with the witch on the handle.
Right.
And they still pop up online
Yep.
sometimes. And tell me why the name Danvers was chosen.
Well, the people of Salem Village were very happy not to keep that name. They just did not have anything that they wanted to do with it. And we think that, you know, today it's when you have political corruption and cronyism and so forth. Well, that was around back in the 1700s as well. In those days, when a new district or town was established, the town didn't give its name, the governor did. And although we didn't have a governor at the time, we had a lieutenant governor, and he asked one of his counselors if he would like to name the new town after somebody in his family, and he did. And it was the Danvers family, an old English family. So it had nothing to do with Salem Village, but they were absolutely happy to do so. It's much like Hutchinson, Massachusetts, Barre, Massachusetts, and many other communities were named after families. So everybody comes and spends their money in Salem, and Danvers doesn't even have a chamber of commerce. But for generations, we were happy that no one knew that we were the place where the witchcraft began.
And we do have the new brochure that links the witch trial sites in Salem and Danvers. And many people aren't aware that the accused hailed from communities throughout what is now Essex County, especially going up to Andover and Ipswich and Gloucester, so it was really pervasive throughout the region. When we talk about the Salem Witch Trials, we will do the quick explanation, that umbrella speech in Salem, that in 1692, beginning in January and concluding in October, 19 innocent men and women were hanged accused of witchcraft, and 1 man was pressed to death.
And don't forget the 5 others who died in prison.
And the 2 dogs.
And
The two dogs.
So what, is that an accurate summary in that quick elevator speech? Is that accurate, what people believe in that immediate takeaway from Salem? That it started in January and in 1692, in this short period of time, the panic, the witch panic, took the lives of 20 people, 2 dogs, 5 in prison.
The dogs were a mob effort, actually.
Oh, it was a mob effort.
It wasn't a legal one. No.
Oh, okay.
The neighbors.
There were no formal court proceedings against,
Against the
dogs. And then also about another 100, close to another 150 people accused.
In jail, but yeah.
In jail.
Not hanged or anything.
And they were imprisoned where?
Some of them were imprisoned in Salem, and some of them were imprisoned in Boston,
Yeah.
which I think is a point that's...
And a few in Ipswich, too. Yeah.
There wasn't
And some some in Cambridge.
Yes.
So
There were lots. I mean,
the jails of Massachusetts were overflowing with people in 1692 and 1693, because the final trials don't end until around May 1693. So it's actually going on for over a year.
And there were actually more trials taking place in 1693, which most people don't even know was a time of trials, than in 1692. But because all of those trials turned out to be not guilty, except for 1 or 2, which the governor reprieved, it's just lost to history.
Well, they threw out spectral evidence, so it was harder to prove anything.
Right. What happened was Governor Phipps entered the court of Oyer and Terminer in October, which was the court that tried the witches and convicted them. But then in January of 1693, there was a new court, actually the first seating of what's now the Massachusetts Supreme Court.
Same court.
And the instruction specifically to the court was that they would not use spectral evidence. So you actually see many of the same judges. Chief Justice Stoughton remains as Chief Justice of the Superior Court. He's joined by Samuel Sewell. Thomas Danforth is on that panel as well, and 1 or 2 others. And but basically, if they're not allowed to use spectral evidence, no one's convicted. There are, as Marilynne said, 3 who confessed and are therefore found guilty. But even in those cases, they receive pardons as well.
Yes.
And who wants to define spectral evidence?
I can define spectral evidence if you like. Spectral evidence was a hot button issue, not only in Salem but in witch trials leading up to Salem. In fact, dating back to witch trials in Britain as well. And the signal question was, could the devil appear in an innocent person's shape? Right. So spectral evidence is when someone imagines that they've seen the shape of a person, like their specter, in effect, commit some kind of crime. And so some theologians thought that yes, the devil could appear in the shape of an innocent person, and some theologians thought the devil could not appear in the shape of an innocent person. So the question was, if I saw the shape of someone do something, is that person's spirit, or is the devil trying to confuse me?
And get that person in trouble too.
And get that person in trouble too. So well-known theologian Cotton Mather believed spectral evidence was legit. His father, Increase, believed spectral evidence was not legit. And this was it was an ongoing debate throughout the Salem period.
I think Cotton had some reservations about it. He couldn't absolutely.
Well, the other question was spectral evidence was thought to be sufficient to create suspicion.
Suspicion, but not conviction.
Or to open an inquiry.
Oh, yeah.
But the question was also, could it be used to actually condemn somebody?
That was tougher.
Right.
And that's because traditionally there's only 2 ways to convict someone of witchcraft, either confession or 2 eyewitnesses to having performed an act of black magic which, since it doesn't really exist, is kind of hard to have two eyewitnesses for, right?
Right.
So what you do is you use the spectral evidence, right, as a way to start the accusations against someone, and then you do what they do today. They get essentially, they get the search warrants. They go into the houses and they start looking for physical evidence of magic. Are there poppets?
Well, and they search people's bodies too.
Exactly.
I mean, I think the most damning, if you'll pardon the word, the most damning physical evidence that could be entered in against someone was if someone was suspected of being a witch. Usually, the person who was suspected of being a witch was a woman. If you were suspected of being a witch, one of the most damning pieces of evidence they could find against you would be to have your body stripped naked and searched by a panel of other women, often midwives, who would look for
doctors,
who would look for the devil's mark on your body. And this was supposed to be some kind of orifice out of which you would suckle your imp familiar. So whenever we see the kind of popular Halloween representation of the witch in the pointy hat with her broom and her black cat actually does have a historical analog, which is the idea that a witch would have an animal familiar spirit attending to her, that she would care for in this kind of perverse twist on maternal care by suckling it. So, there is lots of evidence of people having witches' teats found on their body, and historians have differed over the years as to what those actual things could have been, and it could have been most of anything.
Especially most of us who get a little old, we all realize we have all strange things all over our bodies.
Indeed,
and
indeed.
in 1692, some of those were used to convict people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gross.
Where do we go from
And the one with Rebecca Nurse is actually convicted in part when they examine her and she has a witch's teat, and then they examine her again several hours later, and it's gone.
Right.
So, but again, it relates to the familiars and this whole sort of inversion, because much of witchcraft is really an inversion of the perversion of the natural order. Rather than having normal children, you'll have satanic imps.
Right.
Rather than attending church with Reverend Parrish, you're attending a black mass led by the devil.
So I don't think there's an easy answer to this. Maybe I'm wrong, but what do you think caused the witch trials? What caused that social panic that evolved into the death of 25, counting the people who died in prison?
That's always a difficult question because there really isn't a single cause.
There's no magic bullet.
It was in many respects, it's sort of like, imagine a Venn diagram where you have a bunch of different circles which are different states of affairs, and it so happens that the Salem Panic exists at the very center of several overlapping circles of influence. So one circle of influence would be that witch trials were happening on a semi-regular basis from the moment of settlement all the way until it was outlawed, or until the law was changed. So that's one situation. Another situation is that it was a time of intense social hierarchy along gender and class lines, and that sort of informed the tension. You guys would probably want to add a few other of the Venn diagrams that overlap together. But the other important thing to remember is that a witch trial was not an anomalous instance at this time. A witch trial, witchcraft was against the law. It was a felony in the same way that murder was a felony. And so this was not as anomalous to their worldview.
It was real.
It was real, exactly.
People always look for the explanation of, what were people afflicted, and they'll try to come up with modern medical explanations, which we can discuss and largely dismiss. But the problem is there is a really good 17th century medical condition that these people were suffering from. It's called bewitchment.
Right.
They were bewitched, and it was perfectly legitimate. This was, Salem is one of the last episodes of witchcraft, but it is really fairly small scale compared to many others. Between roughly 1400 and 1750, over 100,000 people in Europe and her colonies are tried or accused of being witches. A little more than half of them were executed. And there are some outbreaks in cities in Germany where literally hundreds of people are losing their lives, if not thousands over a number of years. And frankly, by European standards, what took place in Salem is not even considered a large outbreak, which is a question we can get to at some point. It begs the question of how do we become the witch city? But this is, but
that was my next question: is what is it about the situation in Salem in 1692 that has stuck with the American story and the world story, so that we are the witch city?
It was the last outbreak.
Yep.
Okay.
And after that, there'd be lawsuits for being called a witch, as there was before, and half the time they won when they sued somebody for calling them a witch. People didn't stop believing in it exactly, just not publicly.
And the more it's like, and can you legally prove it? It gets to the stage. I think that, Cotton Mather says, better that 10 witches should live than one innocent person be executed. And then Salem's Thomas Mall ups it. He says, more, better than 100 than one. But the point was, people still believed in witches, as Marilynne suggests. But how do you legally prove it if spectral evidence is no longer acceptable? What is the physical evidence? Again, do you have those 2 eyewitnesses to black magic? Do you have someone confessing? So it's really... it's sort of the end of an era, Salem is, in many ways.
But Salem is a unique situation in that if you go to Europe, they've all heard of Salem witchcraft. If you go to Japan or the Orient, they've heard of it. And it has to do, as Marilynne said, first of all, because it's the last big one. It was also a very democratic event in that you had not the usual suspects, which almost always were the women, but you have men involved. You have different classes of people involved. One of the richest men in Massachusetts, Philip Anglais, his name in here was Philip English, he was accused. John Alden, some very prominent people were accused. The thing that makes it famous, however, goes down to many of the primary sources survive. If you go to Germany or to Spain or whatever and want to look at witchcraft documents, you maybe find a dozen, 2 dozen. Because it happened in such a huge dramatic event, the records get lost. Whereas in Salem, we can find in Salem today 900 plus documents that do survive. And they're documents that speak to us today. They're documents in which Rebecca Nurse or John Willard are actually answering questions to the magistrates.
In their own
depositions in their own voice, and depositions are given by neighbors and so forth. So you had a wonderful body of primary sources that you could use. And historians in the 19th century, Salem was always written up from the time of the event itself. The first booklet that came out was in April of 1692, before the Historia is really full-fledged. And that continues on. So historians have always taken it as a major subject. There's the supernatural aspect of it, which some people find interesting. And there's the humanistic aspect of it, to see what happens to a person in crisis. One of my favorite quotes that comes from the witchcraft events is a guy named George Jacobs, who lived in Salem at the time, now Danvers. And when he was brought before the magistrates for a preliminary hearing, he was accused, and he finally said to them, "Well, burn me or hang me, but I'll stand in the truth of Christ. I know nothing of witchcraft." Heroic kind of stuff that historians and authors like we can take and try to touch the past. Even though it's almost impossible to reattain it and understand it, we can at least touch part of it. And that's what makes Salem so famous today.
I would add to that, Richard, actually, that I think one of the reasons we can't really let it go is because it is so, the Salem episode is so at odds with our national myth about ourselves.
Absolutely.
We look to, especially in the States, I think, we look to the colonial period as part of our kind of founding mythology. And part of our founding mythology is that we came here for religious freedom and we came here for tolerance. And Salem forces us to reckon with the fact that that narrative is more complicated than we're willing to admit. It's like the pebble in our shoe of our national myth, because Salem was a moment of relentless government interference with people's freedom. It's a moment of religious intolerance. It's a moment of tremendous anxiety and violence, state-sanctioned violence, I'd like to point out. And so I feel like the reason we can't let Salem go is because it is so thoroughly at odds with who we imagine ourselves to be.
The fall is so great if you consider, look at the name of Salem. It's from Jerusalem, city of peace.
Salam.
And this is supposed to be the shining city upon the hill. It is a fall from a terribly great height. And also, too, it is to me, I think it is the first large-scale government cover-up in American history.
Interesting. It wasn't exactly forgotten, though.
Well, no, it wasn't, but it was. But there was a publication. Governor Phipps ends it in October with it by enforcing a publication ban, and it lasts 3 years. And in the meantime,
They got them up. They got the pamphlets out anyway.
they did. They did. But it was
Although skeptical tracts about Salem were burned in Harvard Square.
exactly. Yeah.
Allegedly.
So I'm going to just get this out in the open. Ergot and ergotism. We still hear about. I know it was debunked.
It was debunked
40
almost
years ago.
It was
ago,
debunked
right?
within the year that it was advanced, actually.
But we still have people coming to Salem or contacting those of us in Salem to tell us that they know what caused the witch trials, and it was moldy rye, right? And where did that come from?
Back in the 1970s, a woman by the name of Linda Caparel put together this theory that the rye that was ingested by villagers and other people had gone bad, and that it was poison. It was basically, what do you call it?
Natural
Gangrene. Gangrene.
It was supposedly but also produced a natural form of LSD.
LSD.
Yeah.
And that some of the symptoms of people who have ergot poisoning are somewhat similar to those of some of the girls. However, that theory was just absolutely smashed by a fellow named Gottlieb, and I forget the other fellow's name,
Spanos.
who wrote a contrary piece that appeared in Science about 3 months later. They're completely forgotten. Everything we've said in our careers are
Just
forgotten.
like Danvers is forgotten, Richard.
And ergot becomes the key thing, because we often think of the past by reflecting on our own time and what seems important to us.
And this was the days of Timothy Leary.
Hallucinatory things having to do with this master thing is a unified theory that works. What really destroys it is if this ergot poisoning was taking place in a place like Salem Village, population of 500, you would have had a spike in mortality. A lot of people would have died, especially the kids. And once you got ergot poisoning, you didn't turn it on and off,
You don't get
which
better.
the afflicted children and young women could do. At times they were very much afflicted, and at other times they seemed normal. And you would have had gangrene occurring, so that the fingers and whatever would have been off. So
It's a fatal disease.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's like it's the theory that will not die, and it's not a good one.
But
there
I-
are many other interesting theories.
So we
But
all
I think
agree.
the reason that it's so attractive, though, kind of gets back to the same myth-building idea. It would be so nice if there were just one cause that we could point to and that we could consign safely to
Just
the
like
past.
one pill that you can take that will make you well today,
Right, exactly, exactly.
Easy, America loves easy, simple solutions.
And so it's so attractive, because if we can't consign this event so safely to the past, then we can't sit in superiority and superior reflection over what happened in the past, and it means that we're not safe from that kind of panic today.
Right. But if you also consider, too, is that the size of the panic, where you have people being accused of witchcraft in 1692 from Maine to Connecticut. I mean, there was even a recent document that was sold at auction where a fellow in Sudbury, Massachusetts, which is about 40 miles away from here, was accused. There wasn't like one local source of grain that had gone bad. And frankly, too, it's just so many reasons that it doesn't fit from a medical point of view, is from the fact that why didn't everybody act strangely in town? Why only certain people? And again, as Richard said, why do the symptoms come and go? I mean, but that isn't to say. It certainly is possible that maybe one or two people in Salem had medical conditions that we wouldn't understand then that they would know now, that might explain some of what's going on. But I think basically I'm title of my book is A Storm of Witchcraft, and that's because I think that it's like that other Essex County tragedy, The Perfect Storm. You have a convergence of so many different events and stresses, and then actually factors going into why people were afflicted actually in 1692. So ergot is a nice, neat answer. And
and even if you go to the Salem Witch Museum and you see the first presentation, there's always somebody in the auditorium who says, "Oh, they had epilepsy." I hear that every time I'm there, and that, of course, isn't the case as well. So,
it's not Arctic sickness. It's not Lyme disease. It's not encephalitis. Again, who doesn't say that people didn't have those diseases in 1692 or 1792, and maybe it explains some things. But it's
so
just
what was it?
Don't know. Oh, psychological, I suppose, in many cases. I don't think each of the afflicted accusers had the same problems or motives or background. I think it was a variety of things. And I think some of them convinced themselves of what they were saying, and then when they tried to realize that that's not really what it wasn't safe to admit that, because that meant you had sold out to the devil, and that's why you didn't hurt anymore, as Mary Warren found out.
I've always thought that a book back in the 1970s, to me, came the closest, and that was a book done by Chadwick Hansen, which was called Witchcraft at Salem. And although the word hysteria, which I use sometimes, is not politically correct to use anymore, he described it as a mass clinical hysteria. Something that affects, instead of the children being separated so that it would die down, they were let to keep together. And it just fed upon itself. And if anybody within that group tried to stray, they were then accused, Mary Warren, for example. And it's not something, the Puritans weren't stupid people. They had a whole different concept of life and death, and it didn't have the scientific knowledge we have today, but they knew what epilepsy was, they knew what, say, almost fire was, they knew a lot of the symptoms, and this was different. This was completely different. A writer like Reverend John Hale in Beverly described the symptoms and said that it would break an heart of stone to see these children go through this. A parent usually can tell when their kid's fooling around, but this was different. This was different. And we still see that today. About 2 years ago, I haven't heard what's happened to it, but a group of school kids in New York were having strange
You ought to talk about Leroy, because you're just written sort of about that.
It's true. My next novel is a young adult novel called Conversion, and it is in some respect about the afflicted girls at Salem and connecting it to some experiences that continue to happen today. I hesitate to apply contemporary psychological, for one thing, I'm not a psychologist, and for another thing, I feel like individuality was constituted very differently in the historical period, and so applying kind of modern day Freudian terms like hysteria to people living in the past is something that I personally am not comfortable with.
Especially when you're not there to diagnose them.
Right, exactly.
Even if you are a clinician.
And particularly if you look at some of the behavior of the girls at Salem, when they're described as being in their fits, oftentimes it's them being silly or just sort of overturning social hierarchy. So for instance, when Abigail Williams stands up in the village meeting house and confronts Deodat Lawson and says, "Name your text," and Deodat Lawson tells her what it will be, and she says, it's a long text. She's acting like, we would see her acting like a kid, but her inversion of the social hierarchy, her confronting this very high-ranking man, is so unheard of for her social situation that it's taken as an example of her being in a diabolic fit. What happened a couple of years ago is, and this does happen actually with some regularity, in fact there was a similar outbreak in Danvers just last year, in which some adolescent girls, under extreme pressure, develop physical symptoms that they can't explain. And what happened in New York State was that there were a lot of different adults who had their own kind of reading of the situation, that they wanted to apply an interpretation to the situation. Some adults thought that it was environmental pollution.
Toxic waste.
Some adults thought that it was Gardasil. They wanted to blame a vaccine for a sexually transmitted disease, which I think we could all unpack in a pretty intense way relative to Salem. But what it turns out is today there is a symptom called conversion disorder, and what that means is that your body, you're under so much stress. If an individual is under so much stress that his or her body cannot take it anymore, it converts it into physical symptoms, and they can range widely from person to person. And the fact that it happened in a group setting is sort of an element of what used to be called hysteria.
Yeah, mass psychogenic illness.
Now it's hard to say with certainty that that's what was happening to the adolescent girls in Salem, but what we do know is that one of the things that set Salem apart from other witch trials at the time was that the afflicted girls were present when when the accused were examined by the judges, when they were deciding if they had enough evidence to go to trial. And also, these examinations were open to the public, so there was an audience that was there. That was highly unusual at that time. And so it created kind of the perfect set of circumstances. It created a lot of drama, it created a lot of stress and pressure for the girls.
Which makes conversion disorder worse.
Which makes conversion disorder worse, exactly, exactly.
So now, that's a great segue to historical fiction in all forms, but I'm not going to take it yet.
Well, let's follow, I think that, but to follow up on that too, I think, but I think the problem is, again, if you consider that there are over 100 people who are making accusations of witchcraft. We're talking about, and we're talking about, in first case, we're talking about very young girls, like 9 and 11, and then it becomes more so like late teens, early 20s, as well as some moms, as well as a slave, as well as a bunch of young men complaining about their cattle getting sick. And while certainly something like conversion disorder may explain, I think, part of it, particularly the early outbreaks with the girls, it doesn't explain all of it, and I think there's a lot of different things going on. And certainly one of the things that we haven't talked about yet, but is certainly there was clearly some fakery going on too. And particularly too, after the first execution, Mary Warren, I think, is a good example of this. She actually switches sides. She comes out of her fit and says that she testifies that the afflicted girls are dissembling. Which could mean they're lying, but it also could mean that they're kind of out of their minds, they're not well. And she said, you know, boy, I would say anything when I was in that state, but I'm better now. And then what happens, of course, then they turn on her.
Right, they do.
And then all of a sudden, she starts having, wonderfully, she's rendered mute at that point. And after thinking about it for several days, she begins to speak and accuse people again. And the point is, once it starts, you can't stop it. You can't switch sides. And once Bridget Bishop is executed in June, you can't go back, because now this is a capital crime. And there's no easy way to say, wow, I've come to my senses now, haven't I? There's no real easy way to end this.
Right. Interestingly, there is one reflection from well after the Salem crisis ends that is a public apology delivered by Ann Putnam, Jr. She was actually one of the girls who was afflicted right at the very beginning, and she accuses even more people than Abigail Williams, who's more famous because of her appearance in The Crucible. Ann Putnam goes in front of her church in around 1705, and she's still unmarried at this time. I mean, it's clear that she had been from a pretty high-ranking, well-off family, and her experience in the trials has really kind of messed up her life in some regard. And what she says at that time is she apologizes and says that the devil confused them, that they ended up accusing innocent people. So the devil was still involved in Anne's understanding of the world and what happened, but the devil confused them and led them to accuse innocent people.
So she's doing the devil's work rather than Rebecca Nurse.
Exactly. So in effect, it would be the afflicted girls who were under the devil's influence and not the women that they deluded by Satan.
The great trickster.
Of course, a couple of the afflicted died.
Right.
Soon.
During the trials?
Within a couple of years. We don't know. Abigail Williams, we don't know. She disappears. We don't know
what happened to
when
her.
she passes away or if she does for
one
sure.
of the Andover girls and a couple of people and some men.
And what was the age range of the girls who were afflicted? And the initial girls?
The initial 9 and 11, but then
18 and 20.
The key between about 17 and 20 or 21 are where most of the ones who do most of the accusations. And to me, what's interesting is if you look, you do have one or two high status like Ann Putnam, but most of these girls are hired girls, indentured, servants, or in many cases they've lost their dads. Some are orphans. If they do have both their parents, their families are living in reduced circumstances. Many of them are war refugees from the frontier in Maine, where there's a really bad war going on. And most of these girls have very poor prospects for a good life. And there's evidence in the witch trials too, even that some of their masters may be abusing them. Most of the afflicted girls at one time or another talk about specters beating and whipping them. And certainly there's no physical proof that these girls were actually being abused by their parents or by their masters, but I think you can make a pretty convincing case that their lives were pretty rough.
Yep.
And that's certainly the kind of thing that is going to leave you susceptible again to all kinds of stresses. John Proctor, actually, whose servant Mary Warren is in the midst of this. There's one famous incident where he's going over to the village to get her from the trials, and he essentially says, if I could get a hold of her and the rest, I'm going to go home and give her a good beating, and if I could get a hold of all the rest of these afflicted girls, I think this, I'd beat it out of them and would be back to normal here pretty quickly. Now, that doesn't say that Proctor actually did this, but also too, it's kind of disturbing too when a married man of 60 whose wife is actually pregnant is referring to his maid, his servant, as his jade, which is really a flirtuous woman, a woman of ill repute, right? That he's referring to his 20-year-old servant as his jade. It makes you wonder.
Iffy. Yeah. It's iffy.
It is. It is.
And we need to debunk very quickly, nobody was burned in
Nobody
Salem.
was burned in Salem. Nobody was burned in North America, in fact, and no one was burned in Britain. Witchcraft was a felony offense at this time, and so it would have been published. It would have been punished as a felony. It would have been punished as a murder was. Burnings happened when it was an ecclesiastical crime, and so they are much more associated with late medieval and early modern witch trials and heresy on the continent, specifically in Germany, and to a slightly lesser extent, France and Spain.
So we have no religious courts, even though we're a Puritan colony. There are no religious courts here, because in fact, actually, it's really sort of a theocracy where the ministers help run the colony. But there are no religious tribunals here. It is a civil crime, and so no. But it does come in the 19th century. One of the things about Salem and why it doesn't die is because it's constantly brought up as an issue, as an example of bad behavior throughout history. And in the 19th century, during the 1830s and 1840s, Southerners actually start talking about the abolitionists in Massachusetts and how really comparing them to the people who burned the witches in Salem in 1692, and sort of taking that sort of extremism and using it against Massachusetts. And they're some of the first people who actually use that suggestion of burning witches, and they do it very deliberately to make the treatment sound even worse than it was, and it's managed to stick.
Yes. Now the other almost urban legend around the witch trials is the swimming and ducking of witches, and that did not happen in Salem, but it did happen in the colonies a couple of times.
Not very often. I mean, the one that I'm most familiar with actually happened after Salem. There was a woman in Virginia around 1705, 1706 named Grace Sherwood who was accused as a witch. And of course, Virginia had a very different religious structure. It had a very different colonial structure. It was settled by people from a different part of Britain. So it was very different from Massachusetts, culturally speaking, and so witchcraft was much less of an issue for people in Virginia. So Grace Sherwood had a terrible reputation for a long time, but they didn't really know how to deal with her, and especially they knew what had happened in Salem, and so the legal precedent was there. So they decided, well, they looked it up. They looked it up in a book. And they're like, oh, it says here we're supposed to duck her. And so they put her in this ducking stool. They created a ducking stool. And the most hilarious thing about Grace Sherwood is the first day that they planned to duck her, they decide the weather's too bad and it's too cold and they're afraid she'll get hurt. So they put it off. They put it off for a couple of days. So then they duck her. And then they can't figure out what the results mean. They have no idea. They all look at each other and sort of shrug, and they don't know what happened. And so the long and the short of it with Grace Sherwood is that she ends up being found guilty as a witch, but she's not put to death for it. It's sort of like our transitional moment, our cultural transition moment from when being accused as a witch was a death sentence to when it becomes the stuff of folklore. But even today, there's actually, where Grace Sherwood was tried in Princess Anne County, there is a little bitty area called Witch Duck. And it's called that because Grace was ducked there. But what's funny to me is that they did it not because that was part of the culture. They did it because they found a source telling them to do it.
And that's what, when the witchcraft was over, John Hale wrote a book, and he talks about the misuse of so-called evidence during the witchcraft. And one of the things has to do with these tests that were done, which were really extra legal. The thing about finding witch tits on people, being able to touch a witch if you're afflicted, and
Heal them.
it comes back to you. Being able to say the Lord's Prayer without making a mistake. These were extra legal things, and though they were used, what often people think is that we had a kangaroo court that was going around hanging everybody. And I spent a long time co-authoring a book on the witchcraft documents, and what we found once we really went into it and looked at it was that the Salem Witchcraft Trials were conducted as good as any trial in English colonies or back in the home country that were done. Everything was done with the safeguards they had at the time, which are certainly not the safeguards we have today. But they went through a legal process that was including a preliminary hearing to find if there was enough cause to hold a person.
Grand juries.
Grand juries in which evidence was produced by the Attorney General, and they had to determine whether or not there was enough evidence to try or to let them go. And in a few cases in '92, they let them go. In almost all of the cases in '93, the jury came back with, the term was ignoramus, which meant that they were ignorant of the charges. And then the trials themselves, though they were very fast, were still done according to the precepts of the time. So it was not a kangaroo court. It was swift justice, just like
Speedy trial.
you know, no one was put in prison for long periods of time because prisons couldn't keep people.
You wouldn't want to be kept in a prison, which is cold, dark, dank, rotting food, rats, vomit.
Sounds great.
Pretty unpleasant place, exactly.
And that's why when you have the jails in Boston and Cambridge, those were a little bigger. They could handle people, and that's where the witches, especially the confessing witchcraft witches, were kept for fairly long periods of time. In Ipswich and in Salem, it eventually got that at the time of trial, you bring them back to a holding court, and then you bring them through the process.
And then after trial, if they were convicted, it was
Conviction happens very quickly, and there is a chance of making an appeal. Unfortunately, well, maybe fortunately, there weren't lawyers at the time
They weren't allowed to
that
practice.
we understand. The judges were supposed to be able to represent both sides and understand from them. They failed dramatically in that regard. There were some reprieves. Rebecca Nurse was reprised for a short period of time. And you could question whether or not the jurors were good for you. We know that George Burroughs, a minister accused, questioned several of his jurors.
Well, it was quick, but wasn't it also actually not that quick relative to how quickly witch trials usually unfolded? Because my understanding was that, so the accusations began in January.
Right.
The first hanging isn't until June.
Right.
And one of the reasons for that was that the charter had expired. They needed to have the legal authority from England to hold a trial. And so everybody was kind of languishing in prison longer than they normally would have at that time. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, there's a letter back saying, like, we're just waiting on the charter. Nothing's wrong. Everything's cool. We just need that charter. As soon as you can get us the charter, that'd be great.
They couldn't put anyone to death, certainly.
And when the new governor came, Governor Phipps, some say he illegally set up a special court, Court of Oyer Interment, to hear and determine the trials. The interesting thing is that from June on, while the special court is going through the whole process, there's also another section down here of judicial people, the magistrates in Salem and Andover, who continue to hear cases and keep funneling new victims into the system.
Accusations.
In fact, actually, it is an illegal court initially because the situation is such a crisis when Phipps arrives from England. that he realizes that they cannot wait until the General Court to meet in June to formally form a court of order interpreter, which was a common name used in the 17th century for temporary courts for special jurisdiction. And in fact, when it's created, it's not, witchcraft is not mentioned, as Richard knows, in its orders at all creating it. It's a general court actually for the counties, just specifically for Essex, Suffolk, and Middlesex counties, because there might be other issues they might need to be dealt with as well before the court.
And the interesting thing is they do deal with several. One was an Indian who's brought up on charges, so it wasn't just for the witches.
It was a court. In some ways, it became the court of general delivery because there was no law at the time. But Phipps and Increase Mather, when they came back with the charter, they had actually argued with the British king against giving the governor the ability to make such a court, because Edmund Andros, under the Dominion of New England, had that power and had used it very improperly, stripping the rights of Englishmen, in fact, actually leading in Essex County to a tax revolt. Yep. So that just tells you how bad things were, that Phipps realized that he had to kind of go against his grain and the charter to temporarily create the court. Now, once the legislature meets in June, the General Court, they immediately pass a judicial act which essentially makes the court legal after that point. So, and Richard's right in that sense. People were executed and tried very fairly, which to me kind of begged the question of then how did justice fail? And I think
spectral evidence.
Spectral evidence, and the fact they're willing to accept it. But I also think too, a lot of it has to do simply with the fact that one thing that I've turned attention to a lot in my studies are the judges, because you can have as many accusers and as many accused as you want, but unless you have judges willing to convict and sign the death warrant, no one dies. So why do we have a group of, essentially, of hanging judges? And to me, that goes back to, it's a topic of my book, but it goes back to this bigger issue of the problems that are going on in the colony at the time, the fact that the judges are also the militia officers who were leading the failed war campaign, who were also members of the governor's council, who were running the failed government, who have passed an order for moral reformation to try to bring religious reformation to the colony. The judges are also all related to each other. 6 of them are related by marriage to each other. They're all the leading wealthy men of the region. They have similar interests. And the problem is they go into these cases being absolutely convinced that people are guilty. And they're going to use good English justice, but if you go in as a judge who is also a prosecuting attorney, being convinced of someone's guilt, and you read the leading questions that are asked right off the bat on day one of the trials. Why did you do this to the girls? How are you in league with Satan? It's not a question of,
how long have you been a witch?
Right, yes, exactly. Yes, when did you stop beating your wife?
And that's something that you hear, I hear that throughout the community in Salem that is educating the public or interpreting for the public the witch trials, that this comes back to a real judicial challenge.
Yep.
And I think that we need to wrap and maybe I want to give you each the chance to, is there one thing one burning comment you want to add? But I think that is a good lesson that the power and the abuse of power may be the lesson learned from the Salem Witch Trials.
But I think too it was these were very well-intentioned judges. I am absolutely convinced that no one was out to get anybody amongst the judges, but they were absolutely convinced, like many people were, that Satan was amidst in the colony, and it was their job to save the colony, and to do so meant to convict people. So to some degrees it was, as Margot Burns has written in her article on Forced Confessions, it really was not it's a question of not proving your guilt, but basically telling us how and why you did it. And it was predetermined in large part that these people were guilty.
Yep.
One of the things that brought me the closest to a feel for what it might have been like in 1692 in contemporary society is when I watched a couple of Frontline programs back about 10 years ago, when they were talking about back in the 1980s in our United States, in which numerous teachers in nursery schools were accused of sexual abuse. And Frontline had a couple programs that made me think, I'm looking at 1692 society. It's too complicated to get into right now, but if people want to follow it up, it really shows me that I'm not immune to that kind of thing. There are a lot of good people who made horrendous mistakes, and a lot of innocent people who were thrown in jail for huge amounts of time with basically no evidence whatsoever. It was fear that was ruling a lot of people.
And I think that sociological nature in the study of 1692 and the fact that it is applicable to so many contemporary events going right through history is why it is used as the inspiration for so much fiction.
And anytime we can look at, you know, another culture or another society or another period of time and go, ha, silly people, why aren't they sophisticated like us? I think the thing that Salem tells us, I've always gotten two lessons from Salem. One is that witch hunts are around all the time in different guises, and you must look at things with clarity to be able to understand that mistakes can be made by good people that can bring horrendous results. The other thing is the built-in guilt that we had in Danvers and every place else for centuries about the witchcraft. In 1992, when we had the 300th anniversary, what we tried to do in Danvers and what they did in Salem and some of the other communities were to say, yes, the church failed, society failed, the family often failed, the judicial system failed, but what you have is you have some real average people. You know, these 19 who were hanged, some were saints, some were sinners, a lot more sinners than saints. But the one thing that they had amongst themselves was the idea that they weren't going to be bowled over by what everybody else said and what they wanted them to do. There were 40 or more confessors, but these people believed that truth was more important than life. And I think those are the lessons that we want to get from Salem. And I've always said that Salem witchcraft, is a terrible period. We can learn some lessons, but we should also remember that you know, the individual human who didn't want to be a historic character can in fact arise out of terrible things.
Marilynne, anything to add?
We can learn from it, but I think most people not thinking deeply about it tend to think of they were stupid in the old days, and besides Puritans don't know what they're talking about, not like us. But people who should be remembered that tend to be totally anonymous are the like 250 people who spoke up at the time and signed the petitions and testified, or at least on paper, which still survives, which could have been dangerous at that time, and that eventually the government admitted that gone wrong and made restitution of a sort, clearing names that petitioned, and also reimbursing the survivors or their heirs with some of the monies that they had expended, jail bills for grandma, that sort of thing. So some people did stand up, and they tend to be completely overlooked. So let's hear it for them.
Yes, indeed. Katherine.
I don't think I have anything to add. Actually, I mean, I think I would agree with everything that's been said. That the signal lessons of Salem are that, with all the best intentions and all the I's dotted and the T's crossed, that our government, religious, legal, and social systems can still fail us, and that what has to be remembered is individual integrity and bravery in the face of that possibility.
It's a good place to end.
Let me put it this way. If you know, and again, I'm sort of struck by the arrogance that we think we have today, that we have all the answers to everything. Imagine that we're living in 1692. Witches are real. We know this. We know they have the power to destroy everything we hold dear. They want to overthrow our government. They want to destroy our religion, kill us all off if they could, and populate the land with a land ruled by Satan. Okay, how do we stop them? Well, we don't know how to do that, because it could be anybody. Could be your next door neighbor, could be a member of your family, could be that person sitting next to you on the train. Well, then we have to do something, because if we don't do something, they will destroy us. Well, let's look for people who are a little different. Let's look for someone who maybe acts strangely. Maybe they dress a little differently than us. Maybe they speak with an accent. Maybe they don't attend our church, or they worship God a little bit differently from us. So maybe we start to profile and look for them, because they may be the ones. We have to find these people, otherwise our whole society is going to end. Well, essentially, if you swap the word witch for terrorist, you understand the problem that people faced in 1692.
Right. And in our next episode, we can address the question of what would the Puritans of Salem in 1692 think of the Salem community today.
Oh my God.
So on that, I would like to thank Katherine Howe, Marilynne Roach, Tad Baker, and Dick Trask for joining us. I would like to thank the Salem Witch Museum, Tina Jordan, the director, and Stacy Tilney, communications director, education director emeritus Allison DeMario, and from the Witch House, Elizabeth Peterson, for producing this segment about the Salem Witch Trials. Thank you very much.